Sally, it's so good to see you. When was it that we were in contact at the Logan Nonfiction uh what is the retreat? Logan
Yeah,
Non
the Logan Nonfiction Fellowship. Right.
Fellowship. That's the
Um,
word.
yeah, it was late 2019, right? Like October to November 2019. And I was just thinking about that as well. It's kind of strange to think because at that time, my book was a proposal and I had no idea that it was even going to get published. And I think you were slightly further in the process, right? But then I guess like the pandemic started pretty speedily after that, which um, I'm sure slightly waylaid everything for you. But yeah, it's amazing that the books are now out.
Yeah, 2019. I remember that I think that you arrived and you were writing a proposal, I believe, or something. And I it just shows you the different parts of the process because I had been deep into the process and I needed that fellowship to sort of like retool. I had to go in a totally different direction. I had a couple of epiphanies, but it seemed like you picked up from that fellowship and you like sped on. How long did it take you to write the book after 29 that was in October 2019? uh
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I sped on, but I think basically I had no idea how to write a book and had never really met people who had written books and didn't understand the publishing process. And so I think this summer prior to that, I had decided I was going to try and write a book. And I thought that, you write the book and then someone publishes it. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to write like 1,000 words a day. I like Googled how long is a book. I was like, apparently on Google it said 60,000 words. So I was like, for 2 months, I'll write 1,000 words a day because I had all the information already. And then, the book will be ready. And I assume someone will publish it by the end of the year. And I quite quickly realized that's not really how it works. And so I think I applied for that fellowship and was really quite confused as to, the fact that you have to write a book proposal and all of this. And it was actually incredible for me because I finally got to meet people who were, going through that process who I'm sure like at the time I didn't even fully realize, but meeting people and being able to ask very stupid questions like, how do you get I think I was talking to agents, but it was like, how do how does the whole thing work? That like really kind of helped me. But it wasn't until the following summer that I got the book deal. And then I had a year, I think, to actually write the book. And it came out March 2022 last year.
And that I just think back to the group of people that we were there at Logan Nonfiction Program. Just for everybody who's watching, it's not a very well known, and I don't think it is even operational now, but it was a group of nonfiction writers that in a fellowship in rural New York. So around like 7 hours from New York City, or 6 hours, if I remember correctly, and in the countryside, and at this retreat location. But the type of people that came together, there was Frank Smith had just finished his book on the NRA, and it was coming out very like right thereafter. Roberto Lovato wrote Unforgetting, a memoir about being an El Salvador journalist and also a combatant for times and his Salvadoran and family. Andrea Elliott was toward the end of Invisible Child, which went on to win the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction in the United States. I just feel like there's so many of us.
Yeah,
There was so many.
Leona as well. Leona Godin, her book came out
Leona got had
last
just she was
last
just
year, I think.
finishing too, right?
Yeah.
She was just finishing, so there were so many of us, and then the filmmaker, and that's not even to say the filmmakers that were there, and that we were all in different parts of the process. And I mean, I was one of those people who I was writing about healthcare. You were writing about refugees, and it seemed like there was enough overlap among all of our subjects. They were very social justice oriented. They involved discussions and interviews and really immersion with subjects in different ways. I think we learned so much about, you and I came from a different, because you and I were both, amateur writers at this point who came from a different field, you from the law.
Right. Yeah,
and
no, I was
medicine.
working as a journalist, but daily journalism, so
Yeah.
like news journalism. And yeah, it was very different for me because I was based in Uganda at the time, so I was kind of like foreign correspondence, like quite not isolated, but I was doing my own thing. I wasn't really involved in literary circles or anything like this. So for me, it was like a completely new world.
Yeah. And how long had you been in Uganda again?
I can't remember at that time. I think maybe not that. I mean, I had been in and out for about like 2 years before that, but then I think I had been living there full time, maybe most of that year anyway. Um, but yeah, I think journalism, people think that it's the same as books, maybe. I mean, I thought it was
Yeah.
the same as books. That's why I like thought that I could write a book quite easily, but actually it's like a very different industry, and it's also a very different way of thinking about how you write, which like yeah, getting that time out was pretty valuable. Not to make this an advertisement for the Logan program, but yeah, it was pretty like amazing. But yeah, for you, I can't imagine, at least mine, there's a bit of crossover, but for you it's a totally different world.
Yeah, no, I had been also writing some medical journalism before, but I agree. That's why we were both at the time. I was like, oh, I can write a book, just kind of how you felt. Like if you write certain articles, you feel like you can just multiply that and it becomes a book. But I needed the time, and I really did need the voices of others, the help of like the thoughts, the experiences of others to help me put the connective tissue between all of these subjects that because my book is about the work that I'm a doctor at a public hospital in Houston, Texas, which is so many different anomalies come up there. I think in the minds of people, like Houston, Texas, public hospital, in the United States. But I had seen my patients go through not having insurance or being underinsured and not getting the health care they need, and the consequences of that. But I really wanted to be able to write the book in a journalistic way, also in a way that was a compelling argument for public health care. And it wasn't until I was with people who were I will call them my tribe. You all were my tribe. People who lived for these kind of ideas and social justice, ideas of social justice, and trying to put them into words and stories and narratives. It wasn't then that I started to make the mental leaps that I needed to make in order to bring the connective tissue between the stories together so that they could fill out as a narrative.
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, the challenge for me, because my book is about like, really horrific human rights abuses, and I had been reporting on that already for quite a long time. And yeah, you have this challenge with a book. It's like you want people to read it. So like obviously I want everything to be factual, and I had kind of a question of how much information should I put in, because the reason I wanted to write the book was to make sure that this was all documented. But then of course you're questioning, if nobody reads it, like is that of course there's still a value, but like it's better if you also make it readable for people. And yeah, I think it was meeting people who had kind of battled that type of process, like to try and figure out how to sustain a reader and to encourage a reader to actually get through like a long text. Yeah, it was very interesting. But I also think for me, it was just a vote of confidence, because it's like if you see somebody else who has done this, or who has at least like managed to get it, even I hadn't
Right.
got a publishing deal. So you meet someone who's got a publishing deal, you're like, wow, it must actually be possible. It's not like a thing that happens far away, to people who I've never come across. It's like something that may be also possible for me.
I remember clearly we were in that in Logan, and in one of those grand rooms, like this fellowship was located in an area where they had some really grand rooms out in the countryside, and I think it was one of those fireside chats where you started to read to us what you hoped would be in the proposal. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the first line of what you read to us became the first line of your book, which is about like like that you received the tweet that you were, it was the tweet that spurred everything. And I was just so happy to see when the book came out that that was the same sort of, because I think that we had a discussion that should be the very beginning. And I was really glad to see that ultimately was the first line of the book.
Yeah, and also I'm sure you probably did this as well, but the masterclass with Mark Bowden came in, who wrote Black Hole
Yes.
Down, and he, I think, read, I can't remember what I sent him, but he read something from each of us and gave us feedback on it. And he actually, the first chapter is motivated by what he had said should be there. Like, so he was like, because the book is about people trying to reach Europe and not succeeding, and the kind of brutal policies that stop them from getting there. He said you should start in the middle of the sea. Like, you need to start at that moment when that is happening. And that's how I ended up doing it as well. But I mean, yeah, that was his suggestion, which was, amazing that we had that opportunity to get that feedback. But yeah, when I think about it, everyone was doing master classes. You read I think the beginning of your book,
Yeah.
which again I noticed like pretty much stayed, or a lot of it seemed to stay anyway. And I was just going, I don't know what should be in the book. I'm so confused about structure. Like, the part that I asked for feedback on just slightly made no sense, but actually it was very valuable. And it's this horrible thing, isn't it, that you're like, these are real stories, these are real situations. So like, you do feel in one sense kind of like, I don't know, it's a difficult process to then be like, how do I turn this into a kind of narrative that somebody can follow? And I found that kind of disturbing is the wrong word, but like, it was kind of mentally a bit confusing for me that you have to do that. Like, but then also, if it actually creates something that then can introduce people to these topics and these ideas and these stories, that's really valuable. But I think that was part of what I was struggling with, was like, trying to turn real life into not a story, or not, you're treating it like people are characters and they're real people.
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you say that, especially after mentioning Mark Bowden, who also was an enormous help for me, because he was, we had one-on-ones. Mark Bowden is a, distinguished author in the United States, wrote the Black Hawk Down and Killing Pablo, for instance, and he was a guest, and he gave us one-to-one feedback. And one of the things that I learned, and again, this was one of the things that changed the trajectory of my book and made it easier for me to finish it at that time, was just how much he told me about rhetoric, about how this should be rhetoric. I have to notice how to use rhetoric in putting these stories together. And I wonder if that's something that helped in what you just said. Like, it's hard to, one of the things that I found helpful was that if I started to conceive of it as partially rhetoric, then it was more easily like as an argument. I'm making an argument that they became less characters, these real people, and more building toward this larger argument that I was making. And so interestingly, I always saw like the narrative portion and the rhetoric portion as like strands of a DNA molecule. Like they wrap around each other, and they're necessary. But I needed that to know that about the argument or the rhetoric portion, so that it could relax the portion where I'm talking with real life people. Does that make sense? I don't know if you had something similar to that.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think for mine, I was not trying to make an argument, at least explicitly. Like I said, my aim was to provide a documentation of, I had gathered all of this evidence of these kind of gross human rights abuses over, at that point, a year and a half. But I mean, it kept going for another few years. But I wanted just to make sure that that was all properly documented. But I think I was having challenges more related to maybe the kind of experience of working as a journalist, which are things like you're not meant to be in this story, and also just not showing your workings. So like something that I had to get over mentally was the idea that actually sometimes it's good to say what I'm thinking in a situation, like this is what this made me think, or this made me realize this. And initially, I think when I got to Logan, even I was saying, I want it to all be third person. I don't want to be, I was like, I'm going to have myself in the prologue and the author's note, and the rest is just going to be narrative. And I realized for various reasons, including like that it's very hard to sustain a reader without kind of a through line. And because of the way detention centers are set up and everything, the way that the book works, I didn't have like one person or that was going through all of these experiences. And so to have myself as kind of a narrative thread was helpful for a reader. But also like there were things that I was playing a role as well in these situations, and like I think I couldn't really leave that out and not mention the role that I personally was playing as well. But yeah, the other thing was just kind of the broader insights or the broader ideas that I was having. Normally I'd never put them in a newspaper article, but one example is like the way I started to question how language is used. Why are we using the term migrants? That terms like migration management, what does that actually mean? How are they being used to kind of separate people from the reality of human rights abuses that are ongoing? And I thought like actually, it took a while for me mentally to go, actually, I can put that in the book. I can actually say I began to question these terms, and here's what I began to realize about that. And that actually makes it more maybe interesting or powerful for a reader. But yeah, that it really involved a change of mindset, because with journalism, you're just like, I am not in this story. This story is not about me. And of course, this story is still not about me, but just to kind of make it more real, I guess, or more accurate, I had to be in it. And I was wondering that about yours actually as well, like how you battled that, how much you put yourself in and your thoughts and all of that.
That was an enormous, that was the biggest mental hurdle that I had to leap over, was including myself in the book. I did not want so most of the people who appear in the book I was their doctor at this hospital. And I did not want anything about my story to overshadow any of the stories that they went. And also there seems to be a new genre that I'm very reluctant about, which is like a medical memoir, kind of like a memoir about like how difficult it is to be a doctor or get through medical school. Well, and while I understand that, I did not want that to be a part of this book, which was about the travails that I'd seen my patients go through in order to get healthcare, and the larger questions about what is the standard in the United States for giving healthcare to people. So I resisted it very much. I did not want to be a part of it. And then it got to the point where I had written multiple drafts, and I gave it to one of my good friends, a draft, and he read, and he was like, it's not until page 222 that I find out that your dad's a doctor. It sounds like you're withholding something from me. You're holding information from me. And I was like, yeah, I think I am, and I don't know why. And I had to dig deep and think about it. And then something happened that I read a book at that same time, The Social Transformation of American Medicine, a Pulitzer Prize winning book by Paul Starr. Incredible book. And it demonstrated also how in the 1980s and 90s, which was when my father, a doctor, was private practice in Houston, Texas, that medicine was changing, and that it was becoming more corporatized in America, and that even like people who were very private, like private oriented, like my father, he was kind of like the mom and pop shop fighting against a corporate McDonald's of like this behemoth of medicine. And so it became very interesting to me that actually I could find how my own ideas and my own relationship with my father, and the relationship between generations of doctors that had merit narratively within like this, the story that I was telling about. What it made sense that our story impacted the way that my patients did not get health care, you know. And so once that started to come together, then I realized I not only can allow I should allow myself into the book. And that felt, I didn't want to, but it felt like it was the right move. And I'm just curious how you feel now. Like you just talked about how um you could say a lot. Do you like book writing more than you like journalistic writing, for those reasons that you can kind of put yourself in, you can use the narrative threads as yourself? Do you see yourself doing that in future books?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think both serve a purpose, and I guess the issue for me was that, like, I'd get contacted a lot by people who want attention to the situation right now, you know. So I'm not going to stop doing journalism because you have that, you can just have somebody contacting you and saying, you know, for example, right now with Sudan, I'm in touch with people who are trapped in the war in Sudan, and they're saying raise awareness of this, raise awareness of this, you know. And journalism gives you the means to do that immediately, whereas, you know, in the past I might have thought that book writing was a bit like, I don't know how to say this, but like a bit not self-serving, but like a bit, you know, it's you're not fulfilling that immediate need that a lot of
Yeah.
people have to actually create awareness at that moment. But having said that, like, the reason that I wrote the book was that I had this massive information, and that there was no other way to bring that all together and make people see the kind of broader picture and the systems that were underpinning why this was happening. And that just wasn't possible in a journalistic article, basically. And now, and also for security reasons, a lot of my sources, it's much safer to publish something a long time after the fact, because actually it makes it much harder to identify who the sources had been. So for that reason as well, I couldn't publish certain things at the time that I could publish later in the book. And so, yeah, now I've realized definitely both serve a purpose. I'm not like a big fan of, you know, constantly releasing hot takes or whatever, like opinions, but I do think like writing a book gave me a lot of time for consideration, and that's very valuable. And it's made me ask questions about my journalism and the role that it plays, and whether I've also kind of contributed to, you know, situations that may be problematic through, you know, my media coverage, which I think, you know, the media should also be open for criticism. And I think when we talk about like putting yourself in the book, one thing that people seem to have responded to, and I didn't do this at all to, you know, appeal to readers or whatever, but that I criticize myself, and that I'm quite self-reflective as to the role that I was playing, and where it was problematic. You know, for example, the fact that I'm like a privileged white journalist who's writing about this topic. And one of the things I talk about in the author's note, which was before the book won awards, was that when I started reporting on this, I started being awarded, you know, with journalism awards and things like that. And at the same stage, nothing was changing for my sources, and how, you know, problematic that is. And my kind of ethical dilemma, do I go along with, you know, being involved in these awards, etc., because it does raise awareness of the topic, but then actually my career is progressing and the situation is changing, it's staying the same. And I thought I have to talk about that, because that, for me, that is something that I'm really find very problematic, you know. But yeah, I thought being self-reflective and being self-critical, it's also important in these situations, really. And a book allows you to do that. Like, I can't write at the end of a journalistic article like, here's all the reasons that I personally am problematic, you know.
It's interesting. I mean, I experienced something similar, that I felt like that the self-reflection in the book, or at least the acknowledgement of my own privilege, that, you know, my father was a doctor, so that made it easier for me to be, you know, into medicine, gave us private education, all because my book is so much about like private versus public in the United States, and how hard it is for them to come together. And so, you know, the self-reflection about, well, I am cultivated from the private side in many ways. It's interesting that it feels like that's possible now that it might not have been possible decades ago or something like that. Or it's like, at least and that a book gives us that space to do that, to try to, acknowledge that there are complexities about this. I acknowledge the complexity, like I'm the doctor of these people, and they are the ones who have to live with their diagnosis. And there's an embedded complexity in that, that as the doctor, I'm sharing private healthcare information, which is private medical information, which is you need to obtain written authorization from patients in order for them so even when the medical establishment just even hears about a book like this, their thought is like, oh, this must be like their thought is that this is a violation of like the privacy rules. But I think that that's where a book is very nice, the length of a book, to be able to acknowledge those complexities. Do you think you'd want to read part of your book? I know we don't have much time left, but do you want to would you like to read part, and then maybe I could read a portion?
Yeah, sure, perfect. I mean, you can also go first if you want. I don't mind.
Okay. I'll read from the first chapter of my book, The People's Hospital, from chapter 1, Histories. The rumor we heard was that patients arrived with hand-drawn maps, our hospital marked like treasure. The stately Nigerian lady who responded, "Yes, doctor," to everything, metastatic breast cancer. The boy with the black curly hair wearing red Converse All-Stars and a Judas Priest t-shirt that screamed Mexico City, acute lymphocytic leukemia. The grandmother with the sari snagged in the guardrails, chest pain, real chest pain, might need bypass. We stood at these patients' bedsides. We wrote down their histories. We said we were sorry for examining them with cold hands. We ordered blood tests, interpreted EKGs, scrolled through their CAT scans. We input diagnoses. We weren't just doctors. Among us were nurses, social workers, x-ray techs, the people who rode up and down the hallways in the middle of the night, waxing the floors. Some of us wore white coats with frayed sleeves and busted pockets, others tight-fitting scrubs embroidered with our names. In our bad moments, we became tribal. We weren't we were ortho, medicine, plastics, the 4A nurses. We only covered the unit. More often, though, the needs of our patients were so damn immediate, we found a way to work as one. We ran blood transfusions, heparin drips, a morphine pump when Norco didn't touch the pain. When COVID came, we gave oxygen together, one of us twisting the knob on the valve while the other inserted those tiny prongs into flared nostrils. We consulted one another when things looked dicey, surgery if we found boils, ID for antibiotics, and if anything looked remotely like a seizure, a twitch, a rolling of the eyes, we paged neurology overhead. If transportation was swamped, we wheeled them ourselves to MRI, to special procedures, to the cath lab, even the ICU. How downtrodden we looked when we did this, like beaten dogs. We figured out ways to make things work. Not enough money for your meds? We Googled the $4 list at Walmart. Muscles too weak? We dug up a refurbished walker from the basement. Dying and homeless and alone? We called in a favor from the hospice that used to be a Tudor-style home. And when our work was done, once we could envision someone not dying within 24 hours of our discharge order, once the first chemo had gone in, once we could be sure their chief complaint was addressed, the thoughts still lingered in our minds. What brought them here? What are their stories? Ben Taub Hospital, the largest safety net hospital in one of America's most diverse cities. We're Heathrow if you replace the Emirates and the Virgin Atlantic planes with Greyhound buses. There are no atriums with pianists here playing "Here Comes the Sun" to welcome you. No soothing sounds of running water from hidden speakers or, gasp, from an actual indoor waterfall. There is no Starbucks. Our cafeteria serves some form of barbecue most days for lunch and packaged salads topped with egg or chicken strips. That's unless you prefer the full menu McDonald's, located inside the hospital, that's open 23 hours a day. We do have a gift shop, though it looks more like a convenience store, heavily stocked with greeting cards. Not the pun-filled ones, rather the kind that get the point across. Condolences, available in Spanish too. If you type Ben Taub into Google Maps, you'll find it crammed between the Houston Zoo and the 30 other institutions that make up the Texas Medical Center, the largest concentration of medical facilities in the world. Some of the field's most important innovations took place in this medical metropolis. The first successful bypass, the first artificial heart transplants, the first beatless artificial heart. Imagine that, no lub-dub, just a constant whirring. The first silicone breast implant, one of the first civilian helicopter ambulances, the Bubble Boy, all here. Not that the patients at Ben Taub know this. Some may have heard that MD Anderson is rated top in the country in cancer care, or that at Houston Methodist, you might find yourself fortunate enough to have a robot operate on your prostate. The TV ads air in Spanish too. It's possible that at night our patients look out their windows and behold the sparkle of so many new glass buildings, some of them named after billionaire sheiks who sell the oil that becomes their gas. More likely, they're looking out in the direction of the zoo, toward the parking garage and bus stop, wondering how they'll get home. That's the beginning.
Yeah, I remember you reading a version of that in 2019, and I still think it's so good. I should say I have my copy here, by the way. Really excellent, an excellent book. Okay, I'm going to read a bit of my prologue, and just to very briefly describe, it comes after I received the first Facebook messages from people who were detained in Libya. So they had basically been locked up. They tried to reach Europe. They were caught at sea, locked up indefinitely, and started messaging me. What does your phone mean to you? Is it a way to chat to friends or swipe through dating apps? Do you take selfies, send voice notes, or Snapchats? Is it a vital source of information? Has it saved your life? What would it represent if you were incarcerated? Its little screen, your only window to the outside world? What would it be like to spend months or years in the same building without one? Could you share a phone with 500 others? Would you risk being tortured to keep it, or forego eating to buy data, knowing you would starve without food, but could disappear forever if you had no way of sending a distress call? What is it like to watch innocent people being shot through Facebook Messenger? How would you feel listening to their faltering voices as they mentally and physically withered away? That's what I was going to discover. Originally, I believed these first contacts in Libya were an anomaly, the isolated victims of an accidental oversight. Once these people were helped, I thought, my job would be done. I was wrong. Within days, more and more detained refugees began contacting me. They got my number from friends or found what I had been posting online. They sent messages through Twitter and WhatsApp. Their stories were eerily similar. For years after that first message came in August 2018, I messaged refugees and migrants in different Libyan detention centers every day. I imagined the network of hidden phones, the connections between me and them, between them and their families or friends like lifelines, arteries pumping blood. I could not fathom the bravery of the people I spoke to. We talked about the dangers of going public, but if a source wanted to take that risk, I respected their choice. Some were beaten up or tortured on suspicion of sending information. Their phones were regularly confiscated. Still now, I often receive videos, photos, or audio I cannot share. Missing people and evidence of atrocities accumulate in my phone's photo album, in between pictures of autumn leaves or friends' babies. I set WhatsApp to save media automatically because detained refugees send me videos they cannot keep for safety reasons, and I do not want to risk them failing to download. I was getting so many messages at one stage that it was almost impossible to read them all. These images are a sharp reminder of the world's growing disparities. People are more able to communicate than ever before, yet routes to safety are being shut down. Citizens in the West can look away despite windows everywhere, phone screens, TV broadcasts, videos posted online, providing insight into our vast inequality. Anyone who does open their eyes may end up bearing witness to human rights abuses thousands of miles away without any ability to intervene. This is not a story about me, but it is true that when I received those first messages, I could not have anticipated the personal ramifications of reporting on this crisis. The following years would see my life threatened in North Africa and my freedom on the line in Europe. I would travel across 3 continents chasing leads, spending weeks on a ship in the Mediterranean Sea and coming face to face with human smugglers accused of torturing people to death. I would uncover corruption, lies, and gross negligence and be denounced by government propaganda channels. My reporting would be referenced in human rights reports, legal challenges, and a submission to the International Criminal Court, which called for EU officials to be charged with crimes against humanity. I wrote this book because I wanted to document the consequences of European migration policies from the point that Europe becomes undeniably ethically culpable when refugees are forcibly turned away. 70 years after the global refugee system began, we are locking people up for trying to seek safety. We force them out of sight and fortify systems that make it easy for us to forget about them. Some die in captivity and others will be traumatized for life. This book will recount human stories as well as giving some insight into the systemic issues destroying lives, negligence, corruption, apathy, and inequality. It is not a comprehensive account of everything that is happening to people who try to reach Europe, or even to those who are caught by the Libyan Coast Guard. There are new abuses, new humiliations every day, but I hope it plays some role in the quest for accountability.
That's so powerful, Sally. It just drives right at. I think your book drives so much at some of the core questions that we have in, like, our countries, really, about like our identities, who we allow to have certain standards of life and everything. It's so vital, and I just love I love hearing how I can hear, based on our conversation, like letting yourself in there, like that reflection was so much like the point that the little, like the instrument that was needed in that. I can see how if it was just like so purely declarative, it just wouldn't have the resonance that it had when you were just very forward. This is why I write that, you're reflecting on like the use of the phones, your connection to using phones, and in our privileged society, how those phones are used in other societies, and we just needed that eye and everything. So I don't know. I'm just so glad that you found the tools to put it all together.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that, so the prologue was meant to be the part that I am in, and then it was meant to be I'm not there at all. And I think I did manage to stay out pretty much for at least a long bit of the beginning. But yeah, it's tricky with these things because you want to explain, but I think like it was explained to me that when you're trying to bring a reader with you, they can kind of, like, if you explain where you're coming from and how you investigated something and the revelations that you had, it helps them to actually realize those things. And for me, like, the book is about European migration policies and the devastation that they're causing, and I'm a European, so actually, like, looking at it from that eye to some extent made sense, because if a European reads it, and I kind of extend that, I mean, obviously you're American, but like, to all of the rich world particularly, which is trying to keep, erecting borders and making it harder for people to travel there and perpetrating these abuses, like, to read that sometimes through the lens of somebody who's from that place, there is a value in that. But yeah, the whole book is not from my perspective, but yeah, I don't know.
But I liked it in that area, like that in that area, the prologue right there, it sets it up. And it's interesting, like, just thinking about both of our books, I feel like it's your book is centered around a European question, but it's much larger than that. But interestingly enough, I feel like the way that books are sort of unpacked and marketed these days, it's like it's probably much, right now it's like that question about it being the topic of Europe is makes it so that the book is very like Eurocentric in a way, or Euro African centric. And in America, it's a harder sort of. I think it's going to take time in America to see like the like how connected it is, because we have the immigration problems are exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think Because I have an American publisher, but I mean I don't think it's sold very much. But I have done a few, like speaking to universities in America, who are studying migration studies, and yeah, of course there are links. I had that slight challenge of like I had the two publishers, and should I change the US version more to be US, like to keep making references to the US basically. And I mean my publisher there were really supportive and were just like, no, just write what you are planning to write rather than trying to appeal to a broader audience. But I don't know, did you have that as well? Because
that's where I feel like we were sort of because I feel like my book is about American healthcare, but it's more than just it's really, I think, it's about corporatism and capitalism in these societies. And but I think it's easy for an American audience to tap into it because every single person has to deal with this crazy healthcare system that we have in America that is but when it was published in the UK, I feel like it hasn't really sold very much, and it's because it's an abstract concept. I think the way that it's being kind of thought about is like, well, this is why we should be happy that we have the NHS, and I do believe many people in England should be very, very supportive and happy with the NHS. I know that there are problems with it, but at the same time, I think that it's something that the UK should be extraordinarily proud of, you know. But I think I guess the point that I was trying to make is that I feel like I hope I'm not being too hopeful, but I feel like both your and my books, it's just going to take time for it to kind of like those topics to be like recognized in the other parts of like the pond, like to be more universally recognized, you know, because yours is clear. Like I certainly we can draw like the immigration lessons from what you're saying, and I think same from like I'm hopeful that my book will provide help to, you know, in the UK as it's wrestling with, you know, the identity of the private versus public, just acknowledgement of that. So
yeah.
Well, I think back also to the time where you and I were playing tennis at Logan, and it was just a wonderful time that like that also very much helped me. And this has been a little bit like that tennis. We should get together for a tennis game actually at some point, a proper tennis game like in Logan. But
my skills are definitely a lot worse than they were.
Well then we're both going to be exactly where we because I think my skills have deteriorated quite a bit too. It's funny how that maybe goes line in line with like writing perhaps, but yeah, it was so wonderful to catch up with you, Sally, and you've written a wonderful, important, beautiful book and very successful book, and I'm just so happy to have seen it from like its inception almost, you know, or it's close, not inception, but you know, like when you were like when it was growing, when it was on that curve, and to talk to you about it today, it's just a privilege, and you're doing such fine work. It's really a privilege to be a friend of yours, so thank you.
And the same to you. I mean, yeah, it's also incredible to see how far the book has come, and also I'm very much in awe of the fact that you're balancing being a doctor in hospitals with writing. I think that's so important, and it's also giving us an insight, you know, certainly it's giving me an insight into, you know, how that whole system works that I don't think that I had before. And particularly like the empathy in your book, you know, I don't know, as someone who's not in America, we can have a very harsh view, which I know is justified, but a very harsh view of the American healthcare system. And I think reading your book, it does give you kind of hope that there is actually a slightly alternative way, or, you know, there is empathy there, and there are attempts being made there to help people who need it, and to take care of vulnerable people. And yeah, I thought that was really, I'm glad that I had that insight.
And that's like what I think is like I feel like inspired that I know somebody who's also caring, like you care so much about vulnerable people in a completely different realm, you know, which is like through like the refugees and immigration policy. And it's so good to know that people are doing that work in other regards. So keep on doing that work. And I really hope that we have another conversation like this with the Royal Society of Literature in like a few years.
Yeah, thanks so much, the Royal Society of Literature, for having us.
Thank you very much.